right, hello everyone. Welcome. This is an unusual event. It's our first hybrid event, so it's nice to have a live audience, but we're also broadcasting live on Zoom. And so for those of you that are joining by Zoom, welcome. My name is Gene Park. I am the chair of political science and international relations, and also affiliated with the Global Policy Institute. Actually, I see now some more people are coming in, but we're really, I think, fortunate to be able to put together this event on such short notice. We are responding really to kind of what's been happening in the world with Ukraine, and it's been quite a tragedy to bear witness to. Over 3 million refugees, an unfolding humanitarian crisis with issues of food and economic insecurity, and we're witnessing a really powerful change in global politics. It's remarkable to see the reaction, actually, to some degree, that the solidarity within NATO was coalescing prior to the invasion, but it certainly is coalesced now. We're seeing outrage on the part of corporations and citizens, mass protests, including tens of thousands of people gathering before the Brandenburg Gate, but also smaller gatherings throughout the world. There's so many implications that we can explore. Today, we have kind of 3 events to start that conversation. This event really is a good example of collaboration, really across LMU, broadly speaking. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors. It's co-sponsored by the Global Policy Institute at Loyola Marymount University, also the History Department, Political Science and International Relations, our International Relations program, and certainly last but not least, the School of Film and Television. We're actually hosting this event in the Mayer Theater, which has a wonderful tech setup. So thanks to SFTV, and I hope that in the future we can also continue these kinds of collaborations. I should also add that in terms of pulling the event together and the speakers that we brought together, it also, I think, reflects the larger extended LMU community. Everyone who is speaking and participating today is in some ways affiliated or has been affiliated with LMU. We have current students, we have people who graduated from LMU, we have people who have taught or are teaching at LMU, and that constitutes really the bulk of the people who will be presenting today. I'd like to give special thanks to a number of people who made this possible. First off, I'd like to thank Luke Hart Moynihan, who is our administrative coordinator. He graduated from the film school and now he's working for us in the political science and international relations program. And not only did he do a lot of legwork, he actually substantively helped bring the panel together. So thanks a lot for that effort. We have all the students working for the Global Policy Institute and also for the Department of Political Science and International Relations. Special call out to Allison Mullen in the Dean's office. She always has helped us get the word out about our events. And then a really special thanks for Wayne Lindbergh, who is not only going to be leading our conversation with Ambassador Pfeiffer, but also is an LMU alum. And he has been really instrumental in coming up with ideas, reaching out to speakers and making this happen. And of course, I'd like to also thank all the other speakers who have taken time out from their busy schedules to join us today for this event. And lastly, thanks to all of you for joining us either virtually or in person. We thank you for your curiosity and willingness to come out and try to educate ourselves about this unfolding tragedy. This is a multi-part event. It's a little unique. As I mentioned before, it's hybrid with a live and a Zoom component. We'll begin our conversation shortly. It's going to be a conversation with Ambassador Pfeiffer, who I'll give a proper introduction to him in just a moment. That will continue on until 3:30. From 3:40, we're going to start a panel, Voices from Ukraine and Perspectives from Russia. We're going to have 2 Ukrainian speakers along with Nigel Robb, who is a history of the Soviet and post-Soviet era. At 5 o'clock then, we'll transition and we'll show interviews with Ukrainian citizens. And those interviews will have subtitles, so we can hear directly from people in Ukraine. And then after the event, we hope that you can continue the discussion informally. We're going to have food and drink outside. So you're welcome to continue and talking about what you heard today. So now let me start with introductions. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Pfeiffer, and he is currently the William J. Perry Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also affiliated that's at Stanford University, by the way. He's also affiliated with the Center for International Security and Cooperation and the Europe Center, also at Stanford. And he is a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. He's a true expert on Ukraine and the post-Soviet region. He's written a book on US-Ukrainian relations. In addition, he spent much of his career as a foreign service officer in the State Department, specializing on the region. Among some of his many, many career highlights, these include serving as US ambassador to Ukraine, also as a special advisor to the president, and also serving on the National Security Council. So we are deeply grateful that he's made time to join us here. We're also very grateful to have Wayne Limburg, who I mentioned earlier. He's going to be leading the discussion and asking questions in an interview style with Ambassador Pfeiffer. As I mentioned before, Wayne is an LMU alumnus, and over the last few years, we've gotten to know each other pretty well. Met up in DC, and we've done a number of events together, including an event with Fiona Hill on Russian influence peddling in US elections. It's really been a pleasure working with him, and I should also add that he has incredible credentials and expertise on the area that he'll be discussing today. He started his career at the CIA and then moved to the State Department, working specifically on Soviet and then post-Soviet issues. Dr. Limburg, who has a PhD in history as well, has received the Department of State Meritorious and Superior Honor Awards for his work on the Soviet and Russian foreign policy. In 2005, he became the first State Department representative on the planning and coordination staff of the President's daily briefing. Later that year, he became director of INR's Office for the Analysis of Russia and Eurasia. And on his retirement in 2014, he received the department's Career Service Award and the INR's Centurion Award. So we have brought together, obviously, people with incredible expertise on Ukraine, Russia, and all of the issues that we're now witnessing. Last but not least, I'm going to introduce Veronica Backer-Corral. She is a student here at LMU. She's a Phi Beta Kappa member. She is going to be heading off to Princeton next year, and she recently was awarded Fulbright. And she'll be basically moderating the Q&A. So let me just pause for a moment. This hybrid format's a little unusual. We will have a Q&A session after Wayne concludes his conversation with Ambassador Pfeiffer. But to accommodate both live and people watching on Zoom, what we're going to do is pass out some little note cards, or actually more like Post-it notes, and we'll give those to you in the audience. And as you're listening, and if you think of a question, just write something down, and you don't need to wait. You can just raise your hand. There'll be people out in the aisles who will collect those, and then at the end, we will read those questions and get Ambassador Pfeiffer and also Wayne Limburg to respond to them. So is everyone clear on that? So again, as you're listening, there's no need to wait as you think of a question. Please just write it down and raise your hand. Okay, let me just make sure. I'm actually about 3 minutes early, so I'm not actually sure if Ambassador Pfeiffer is on. Does it look like not quite yet, right?
Oh, he's there.
Oh, he is here. Okay, all right, great. We can start.
I'm here.
Oh, yeah, I see. Discreetly with your camera turned off. Welcome, Ambassador Pfeiffer. So without further ado then, I'd like to turn it over to Ambassador Pfeiffer and Wayne for a conversation.
Thanks, Jane, for your kind introduction. It's good to be here. I guess I can say it's good to be back at LMU, even though I'm sitting in Arlington, Virginia, but some other time. Ambassador, good to have you with us. You were one of course, when we were getting this together, one of the first people I thought of. So thanks for being able to join us. And just for old time's sake, since we do go back a ways, let me just start with, did you ever think we were going to be here where we are today?
Talking about this subject, no. but let me also say though, for the audience, one of the reasons why I learned a lot about the Soviet Union, the post-Soviet states, was Wayne and people like him who really made us in the State Department smart about what was going on there. So let me tip of the hat to you.
Okay, well, let's begin. I think maybe to start, and I will say that things are moving so fast that we probably can't even be held to what we're saying today. On many of them, we could even be revising in the middle of this conversation, but we'll see. But one of the things I thought it might be a good idea is to start with sort of the bigger picture, and that is when I said, would we think that we're going to be here and why we're here, but really where we are now, as Jean alluded to a little earlier, in sort of the world and the world stage. And I guess I'll put it this way: for you, Ambassador, has Russia's invasion of Ukraine created a seminal moment or watershed in international relations and the world order that really rivals at least the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and may even surpass in the long term the effects of 9/11?
Yeah. Wayne, I think that may be the case. I regret that. I mean, like you, we spent a lot of our career at the State Department working on trying to find ways for better relations between Washington and Moscow, both with the Soviet Union, then again with Russia. But I have to think at this point, we did not succeed. And so I think regardless of how this war turns out, whether Russia prevails militarily, and I still think that's an if question, it's not a when question, and even if the Ukrainians hold out, there's going to be a significant distance between the West, by which I mean the United States, Canada, and Europe, probably other allies like Japan and Russia. And it's going to take a long time to overcome that. I mean, this Russian readiness to use military force in this way without, I think, any real justification is going to cause countries, and you see it, for example, in Germany, the reassessment of Russia. And in 1 week, German policy basically erased 5 decades of German policy towards Russia. So I think it's going to take a while to overcome that.
Just follow on with that one. Are you comfortable with saying basically that we are entering, and I know it's a hard one because you have to qualify quite a bit, but we're actually entering a new Cold War?
Yeah, I guess I tend to avoid the term Cold War just because it was so different. I mean, the Cold War was not just a political rivalry and a military rivalry, but it was also economic and it was also ideological. I don't think Russia really has an ideology that has mass appeal. I mean, it has appeal to kleptocratic autocrats, but not many else. And economically, I mean, if you look at the West today, if you take just the United States and Europe, you're talking about a combined economy that's anywhere from 15 to 20 times size the Russian economy. And certainly Western economies were bigger than the Soviet economy during the Cold War, but this is hugely different. So I think it's going to be a difficult period, but it won't have some of the attributes of the Cold War. And if the West stays properly focused, it should be an easier job, I think, of doing what needs to be done vis-a-vis Russia than it was during the Cold War when the United States was having to deal with the Soviet Union.
Just elaborate a little bit on that last point, that being first, how do you see the Western alliance maintaining its unity, and also how it would be easier?
Yeah, well, again, I think the invasion that Russia launched 3 weeks ago into Ukraine has really sort of galvanized NATO. And again, I'll take the example of Germany. Back in 2014, after Russia seized Crimea and then provoked the conflict in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, NATO members agreed that by 2024, they would be spending 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. That was the target. Germany had done quite a bit. I think it came up last year to about 1.5% of GDP, but its track was going to say, well, we'll hit 2%, not in 2024, but more like 2030. The German chancellor 2 weeks ago said, we will exceed 2% in our next budget. And then he said, in addition to that, Germany will devote 100 billion euros. That's more than twice what Germany spent in its 2021 defense budget. They're going to put that in the next year or two into defense spending. That's going to be big. And so I think you're going to see an alliance that recognizes that Russia is prepared to use military force in ways that we did not think they were, say, certainly not 10 years ago, but perhaps not even 3 or 4 years ago. And that there needs to be a strong and clear defense. I think that's going to happen. And I think it's been made easier by Russian actions, particularly of the last 3 weeks.
Okay, thanks. In the run-up to the invasion, we were in many discussions,
Yeah.
working groups and panels. There was considerable debate over whether Putin was pursuing a overarching, thought out, well-planned strategy that had been sort of in place. You know, it goes back to the idea that the Russians are always chess players, the rest of us play checkers, sort of thing. Or was he a more, and I have to admit, I tended to fall on this side, a more opportunistic approach aimed at testing what Moscow saw as potential divisions in the West and Western readiness to confront Russia. Looking back, do you think this debate has been resolved, or do you think it's still an open issue?
Yeah, I think I tend to side with you, as I'm not sure that Putin is the great strategist that some people credit him with. I mean, I look at what Russia has done over the last 8 years to Ukraine, and I assume that the Russian goal, or the Russians would like to bring Ukraine back into Moscow's orbit. Nothing is done more than Russian strategy and policy of the past 8 years to push Ukraine away. It's the seizure of Crimea, then this conflict in Donbass, which even before this invasion had killed 14,000 people. And you would see it, for example, 10 years ago, if you asked Ukrainians in a poll, should your country join NATO? You know, maybe 15% would say yes. The last poll I saw, and this was before the war, or before this invasion began, it was 62% of Ukrainians saying yes. So if there's a strategy there, it's, I would argue, been a massive fail for Russian interests. But I don't think Putin is such a strategist. I think he's a tactician. He's an opportunist, and that may explain why this crisis is happening and this war is happening now, is that I think Putin probably saw, in terms of relative power, Russia vis-a-vis the West, maybe this was the best possible time to move. He had just completed a 10-year modernization program of his military. We're, I think, seeing that maybe didn't turn out quite as well as the Russians had thought. You know, he had put away $600 billion in foreign reserves, so he thought he could withstand an economic sanctions, although the central bank parked about 60% of the reserves in Western institutions, so they're now frozen. And then I think he looked at the West and he said, you know, this is actually probably a good time to go against the West. Look how divided the United States is. Look at the British Prime Minister, Johnson. I mean, there's a question, will his own party boot him out? In Germany, you've had a chancellor who's basically brand new on the job, and the French are going to be preoccupied with their election. So he might have thought this was a good time to move. And from his perspective, maybe Russian power, in part because I think their economy is relatively stagnant, you know, was not going to get any better. So he took advantage of what he saw as an opportunity. But he made a huge series of miscalculations across the board. And that has put, I think, Russia into the position now where they're nowhere near obtaining the military objectives that they thought they would obtain. And they are facing, I think, much harsher economic sanctions than they ever anticipated.
On that idea, that, you know, and I think, I think I would agree, and I haven't actually heard anyone that I take seriously disagree that he did not miscalculate, that he miscalculated on this. In the days immediately following, particularly the Russian invasion, some commentators, pundits, had begun to question Putin's mental balance, that it was so striking. Now, I want to separate that a little bit. We can maybe return to it about this. What strikes me is And I have to admit, I can't quite figure it out, his obsession with Ukraine.
Yeah.
But in on this terms of the mental balance, the word crazy was a word heard more than once.
Yeah.
Irrational, whatever. But there is this idea that, you can be crazy as a fox. And this, I think, was what you might have been getting to when you said that as his calculations, he looked at divisions in the West and weaknesses. And Henry Kissinger has argued that seemingly mad or irrational behavior by a leader can have advantages to the degree that it keeps its opponents off balance and cautious. Is there any chance that's what we're seeing with Putin?
Yeah. I guess I wouldn't rule it out, but I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think he's crazy, but I do think he's changed. I think, and again, let me say, I've been watching this from, thousands of miles from Moscow. The last time I saw Vladimir Putin in person was 20 years ago. But I do think he's a little bit more emotional and even angry. And it comes out when he talks about Ukraine. And I do wonder, does that cloud his judgment, that he is maybe not making the careful assessment of risks and costs on one hand and benefits and gains on the other? And that the kind of calculation that he might have made 10 or 15 years ago. I also wonder, and again, it's entirely speculation, but we've always assumed, and I think with good reason, that Mr. Putin operates in a very closed circle. Typically an inner circle that's described of maybe only 4 or 5 people, most of whom come from the security services and have probably a very similar world outlook and a similar set of views as he does. But I think that circle has become, if it's possible, even more compressed over the last 2 years, because his isolation has really been remarkable during COVID times. And then even things like when he met 2 weeks ago with his defense minister and the chief of the general staff, they're down the table 30 feet away. Presumably those guys got COVID vaccinations before they got anywhere near Putin. And presumably they got the Pfizer, the Moderna, not just, what they give in the Sputnik in Russia. So I think there's something there that, again, it's not crazy, but, it's a little bit more emotion. It's a tighter circle. He's getting a thinner set of inputs than he should be getting. And probably he's reached the point now where I'm not sure there's many people prepared to challenge it. We saw the report, for example, of the 2 SV officers, I believe,
Yes.
being fired and then arrested. Well, I guess my question is, were they arrested because they gave him bad intelligence in terms of predicting what would happen in Ukraine? And then there's 2 variants. Did they not understand what was going on in Ukraine and gave him their best estimate? Or did they say, he's not going to like this? So they shadowed it and they gave him what he thought he wanted to hear. And I've questioned this for several years now, whether Putin and the Kremlin really understand Ukraine all that well. And just give you one example, is back in 2013, which is the last time that Putin was in Kyiv. He was there to mark the 1,025th anniversary of Kievan Rus, which is claimed by both Russia and Ukraine as their founding state, but Kievan Rus accepted Christianity. And he gives a speech, and the big theme is, we Russians and Ukrainians are one people. And he repeats that. That's an utterly tone-deaf thing to say in Ukraine, where for ethnic Ukrainians, what they hear is, you just, ignored my history, my language, my culture. So I do wonder about the quality of information that's getting to the Kremlin. And I do wonder if those people in the Kremlin really understand Ukraine that well, because they certainly seem to have been surprised by the fact that Ukraine is resisting with tenacity and determination. And quite frankly, had Putin asked you, Wayne, or me, or any of 30 or 40 other people who follow Ukraine in Washington, D.C., we all would have said, no, the Ukrainians are going to fight, and they're going to fight hard. But that seems to have come as a surprise to the Kremlin.
Well, I agree. And one of the things that the stories that got me with that, I was kind of, in a very difficult time, but there was a certain amusing side to it. When the soldiers were going in, the first Russian forces, they were actually stopping Ukrainians, little old ladies, at their shopping bags and asking them for directions. with the and how do they get to the next street, or how do they get to the next road, the crossings and they seem to have this idea that, well, gee, we're liberating you, and
Well,
you're going to help us here.
yeah. Well, the initial effort to take Kyiv in the first couple of days, I mean, it was relatively small ground units going in, accompanied by this group of airborne troops that were helicoptered in, and they took the Hostomel airport, which is, I've been there. It's about 12 miles from downtown Kyiv. But they spent those small units, and that's the kind of force that you would send in, saying, well, no one's going to resist. They'll welcome us as liberators, and in fact, the Ukrainians repulsed them quite easily. And what you've seen, I think, for the last couple of weeks now is the Russians trying to figure out how to marshal forces and get them in place to actually try to encircle Kyiv. But yeah, there were some pretty bad miscalculations made by the Kremlin, in part because they didn't understand the Kremlin. And I'm not sure if that's just Putin's bias,
yeah,
whether he's getting bad information, or whether the people below him are not giving him the right information because they don't want to upset the boss.
Well, let me do a little projection on from U.S. to Russia. If this sort of a goat rope had happened to the United States, we would have heard the term intelligence failure.
Yeah.
That, and again, I think it struck us all that watching now that we had the two intelligence chiefs reportedly arrested, removed from office and arrested, some of the generals also removed. That, and this idea that, again, like if you would comment on that, would you have it already? But the other thing is about this whole idea of miscalculation, whether it was the matter of the Western read of NATO. And I agree, I think he doesn't understand the Ukrainians. I've never really thought he understood NATO and the EU. I mean, he just did not get how that organization works. And for any outsider, it can be a little confusing. And I think that people tend to miss the point that there's always a great deal more unity than it looks like on the surface. It's kind of like a family dinner. Everybody has to, bicker a bit and argue and decide what they're going to do. But when it comes to it, they're still part of the same household.
Exactly right.
But in any case, what I'm getting at here, what does this say about not just his, for us on the outside? Well, I would say the other miscalculations were, as you said, the determination of the Ukrainians to resist, and of course also just their own military capabilities that we might want to return to in a few minutes. But what does this say about Russian, not just, and Putin's, which you've already talked to a bit about, analysis and decision making, especially in the future? And for us on the outside, and me as an intelligence professional years ago or in the past, and you on the policy side, what does it say about our ability to predict what Putin or the Russians might do?
Yeah. Well, let me, we're talking about intelligence failure on the part of the Russians. Let me talk about intelligence success on the part of the US intelligence community. And this is one thing I think that the Biden administration did that was probably not easy, but they declassified things that maybe 10 years ago we would not have declassified. And they said things, and quite frankly, go back and look what the US intelligence community was saying in January. They called it. I think they probably missed the invasion date by 5 days, but they were telling everybody the Russians are going to use military force, and it's not going to be small, it's going to be big. They called it exactly. So that I think gives me some more confidence. I think it's still hard to really predict what goes on in the Kremlin, just because it is a pretty closed entity. And I remember talking about 4 years ago with a senior embassy officer who just returned from Moscow. And his observation was interesting. He said, it's harder to figure out the Russian leadership now than it was during Soviet times.
Oh, absolutely.
Because in Soviet times, he said, at least every Great October Revolution Day, all of the Politburo got up on the top of the Lenin Mausoleum to watch the parade. And you could say, oh, look, the Minister of Education, he's moved two places closer to the center. He's on the upswing. And you don't have that at all now. So I'm not sure we have a lot of insights. And again, what's probably to the extent we're trying to figure out how to affect calculations first and foremost by one man, Vladimir Putin, my guess is it's become harder because there's now this emotional aspect at play.
Yeah, I agree entirely, and especially the comparison to the Soviet. And part of it was because while hardly a democracy, it was a group leadership, a collective leadership. And we knew, if nothing else, we knew there had to be certain meetings held to make certain decisions. And those could not be hidden. They were public, and we had a certain way of communication, task statements, foreign ministry statements, and whatever. And I think we also had more entree into that bureaucracy that and in fact, you had mentioned it earlier, we had even more entree into Putin's just a short time ago. Not as much as we had in Soviet, perhaps, not as great, but now it's even, it's so small. I mean,
and in Soviet times, there was the Politburo.
Right.
And it had power. I mean, the Politburo in 1964 fired Khrushchev. There's no group like that. And again, the small circle, I mean, there was a documentary that Putin did, or he took part in back in 2015. And it was about, the military seizure of Crimea, what the Russians were called the return of Crimea to Russia. And he basically, and I forget the exact names, but he said he ticked off the 4 guys who were in the room. And it was a really small group. And, when he made that decision. So to the extent he does consult with people, it doesn't seem like it's a very broad group. And to the extent that they're all have the same worldview, it means he's getting a pretty thin spectrum of information when he perhaps would benefit if he got a wider spectrum.
Right. And I was going to say, even back on the idea of the Politburo decision-making, one of the reasons Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine was he wanted the Ukrainian first secretary support in the Politburo.
Yes. So
he was playing politics even then. All right, miscalculations, predictability, or not. Did the US and its allies, because we're starting to hear a buzz in the United States, even on the Hill here in Washington, whatever, that whether the US and its allies sufficiently signaled Putin about the costs of military action against Ukraine would be as high. I guess what I'm actually saying is there something we could have done, the West could have done, and more to deterring?
Yeah. Now, I go back to, Putin was hearing at the highest level directly from President Biden. They had 3 phone conversations, I think, since early December. And after that first phone conversation in December, the White House, they basically said, we have a sort of a 2-pronged approach. One prong is, we're ready for diplomacy. We'll look for a way to help the Russians get out of it. What was then a crisis, not yet a war. And that, I think, shaped the response that they took when the Russians presented these 2 draft agreements, which I think now in retrospect were not presented in good faith. But they were very clear saying, but if the Russians do invade, which we are trying to deter, that was the White House view, there will be costs. And we've told the Russians what the costs will be. There are going to be more sanctions. There'll be more defensive assistance going to Ukraine. And there will be a greater NATO presence on its eastern flank in countries like the Baltics, Poland, Romania. All things which the Russians presumably would not like. Now, and I think they tried to make those very clear. I think each of the conversations, I believe that the president articulated that to Putin. I think when Jake Sullivan talked to his counterpart, Patrushev on the Russian Security Council, he articulated that. They said it publicly, repeatedly. Where they may have failed was they probably didn't. I'm not sure anybody in December would have predicted the scale of the sanctions, how much defense assistance going, and then the military buildup. So what you've had is on the last one, building up NATO's eastern flank. For the first time ever, NATO's activated its NATO response force. You have now, instead of where I was probably about 3,000 American troops in Poland, I think it's over 10,000 now. You've got American troops, more Germans, more British troops in the Baltic states. The French have deployed forward. The Dutch have deployed forward. I mean, there's a lot of military capability now in the Baltic states and in Poland and in Romania and other places on the eastern flank that are designed both to assure those countries, but also to signal Moscow that while NATO may not fight for Ukraine, it's certainly going to fight for NATO. On the arms flows, I mean, 2 months ago, you had the United States, Britain, Poland, Lithuania, maybe one or two other allies providing defense assistance to Ukraine. I heard 2 days ago the number is now 30 countries, including neutrals like Sweden and Finland. And it's not just defenses. I mean, they're providing weapons. I think that was probably not expected by the White House. And then again, the sanctions, and particularly the readiness of the Europeans to hit hard with sanctions. So I think two things. One was to invoke the mechanism of cutting at least some Russian banks off of the SWIFT international payment system. But then what probably caught the Russians totally off guard was the decision to basically sanction the central bank of Russia. And this was, I mean, Putin, I think, had always seen his war chest. It was going to get him through any kind of sanctions. He had this $600 billion in foreign reserves. But the central bank of Russia had 60% of those reserves parked in Western financial institutions. Those are all now frozen. They're unavailable. And a lot of the reserves that are in Russia are gold, and the sanctions are going to basically prevent the Russians from selling that gold. So again, I think the administration tried to articulate the costs, what they probably underestimated back in December, because they didn't expect to be so successful in each of those areas. But I'm not really sure, what else they could have done. I mean, there has been, I think, a pretty clear line about not having American and NATO forces go head to head with Russian forces. So I think they did about as much as they could in laying out the cost and then laying out this alternate diplomatic track. But I think we're now learning that Putin was probably pretty determined at some point for early in this year to go to war almost regardless.
Yeah, I think I agree. In fact, I have to admit, right on up to the end, I was given what we were prepared to offer on exit ramps and whatever. And then his move into Luhansk and Donetsk and declaring their independence and peacekeeper. I kind of thought that was going to be his taking the exit ramp, because it was not a bad deal given what his, I think, overarching goals in Ukraine.
Yeah, but he overreached. He miscalculated.
And as again, that's why, I hate to try and play Freud here, but this idea of an obsession, with Ukraine. But on that, let me.
Just, I mean, if you go back and you read that essay he wrote about Ukraine last summer, and then, I mean, the speech he gave on February 21, which was an hour long, it really was close to a rant. It was intended to justify the decision he had taken to recognize the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. But I think it was pretty clear, I mean, if I had any doubts that the Russians were going to go to war, I saw that. I mean, that was the declaration of war against Ukraine. But it does, though, show somebody who really, I think, has a very distorted view of Ukraine's history. He doesn't accept the right for Ukraine to exist as a sovereign state. And again, not understanding Ukrainians, I think he thought that what he was doing was going to be popular in Kyiv, or probably popular throughout the country. I mean, and what you're finding is, the resistance is really everywhere in Ukraine. I mean, one of the really interesting or sad things for Mariupol, but Mariupol is a predominantly Russian-speaking city. Close to half the population is ethnic Russians, and they're getting pounded into the ground by the Russian army. It's sad and it's tragic, and it's bizarre for a Russian government that back 12 years ago asserted for itself by law the right to protect Russian compatriots abroad. There's nobody killing Russian compatriots abroad now more quickly than the Russian army.
Good point. Now, so we're in it. We're in the midst of it. Yeah. And now, I mean, I'd used the term exit ramps a little earlier. Arguably, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was ultimately resolved because we were able to give Khrushchev a way out, a face saver. And it was a compromise with a trade-off on taking missiles out, whatever. And of course, as we were saying, we tried, I think, in the West to give Putin these exit ramps on the run up to this. But he, as one wag said, he always chose the passing lane and accelerated. But are there exit ramps now?
I think so, but the further the war goes, the harder it's going to be for Putin to slow down and take one of the exit ramps. I mean, there have been these negotiations going on now for about 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems is, though, when you look at what's being said by the Russians publicly, including by Putin himself, and again, he did this fairly lengthy speech about 2 days ago, there seems to be a disconnect between that and then some reports that suggest there may be at least a bit of progress in the negotiations. And the one thing it seems that both sides say that they're talking about, and President Zelensky of Ukraine, he's been raising this idea publicly now for 2 weeks that Ukraine might be prepared to accept neutrality and set aside the desire ultimately to join NATO. But there's a lot of questions about, but he wants some guarantees. And I'm not sure how those guarantees work. I mean, remember, Ukraine had from Russia not a guarantee, but an assurance, and it's kind of a close term. Back in 1994, when Russia, along with the United States and Britain, committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity, committed not to use force against Ukraine, committed not to threaten use force. Of course, the Russians have violated all of that. And that was actually key to Ukraine giving up what was then the world's third largest nuclear arsenal on its territory. So how do you get a guarantee that the Ukrainians are going to have confidence? And I think that's going to be complicated. And then do the Ukrainians then ask for others like NATO? We want a guarantee from you that if the Russians violate our neutrality, there will be help in that, So I think there's some real complications there. But it's also complicated by the fact that, Putin still talks about demilitarization, denazification, which I think is his code word for deposing the current government, which he talks about as being led by neo-Nazis. Of course, the president of Ukraine is Jewish and lost 3 uncles to the Germans in World War II. So you see that, and it's kind of, we're not quite sure where this is going to play out.
And certainly this is the line that we're seeing on Russian TV. I mean, the message,
And it's also, Ukraine has to recognize and accept Crimea as Russian territory. Ukraine has to recognize the independence of the 2 Donbass People's Republics. But that's even harder for the Ukrainian government, because when Putin and the Russian government recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as independent states, they recognized them in the administrative boundaries that those of Ukraine. Prior to February 24, the 2 People's Republics controlled only about 35% of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Russia is now recognized as all of that territory, including territory which is now still under Ukrainian control, as part of these. How do you resolve that? So there's to get an exit ramp, at some point, the Russians are going to have to be getting a little bit more realistic in what they're demanding of the Ukrainians. And the longer this goes on, and if the Russian military continues to underperform, and bear in mind, it's not that militarily, I don't think the Ukrainians have to win. They just have to not lose. And they're doing a very good job of not losing now. And they're going to be getting, this stream of stuff coming to them is, I think, about to become a flood. So they're going to have a lot of capabilities. And, somebody said that they're now bringing Russian troops out of South Ossetia. I saw on the news last night that there's a Russian cargo ship coming from like the Far East, like Vladivostok, and it's loaded with military equipment. This really suggests that the Russians are militarily haven't planned for what they've met, which I think is a good thing. And I don't like to see individual Russian soldiers die, but I think to the extent that the Ukrainians continue to inflict damage and casualties on the Russian military, maybe that has a chance of affecting the calculations in the Kremlin.
Thanks. I just wanted to tell the audience, though, so that they know that the ambassador's reference back to '94, the Budapest memorandum, and the assurances, and that the ambassador was instrumental in getting that memorandum created and that agreement created. I remember morning briefings with him, and it could be frustrating, but it was really a diplomatic coup when you think about denuclearization of Ukraine, and for that matter, then Kazakhstan and Belarus.
Yeah, no, I mean, I still think, these were in Ukraine, 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads that were designed and built to strike the United States. So that was very much in our interest. Almost every time I've been back to Ukraine since 2014, though I get that. You got rid of our nuclear weapons. And again, I'm not sure Ukraine could have maintained the weapons in any case. And, Ukraine probably would have ended up as a pariah state as they tried to do so. But one can certainly understand that feeling now in Kyiv was that, if they had a nuclear capability.
I want to hold on that just because I want to get back to that point in just,
okay.
in just a minute. But let's go on now. Some commentary specialists, including Rose Gottmiller, in the recent Foreign Affairs article, has said that one of her concerns from the very reason is that what we could see coming out of this, a real downside of the larger conflict for the world, is a real challenge to the non-proliferation regime and treaty.
I think she's right. I mean, the Budapest Memorandum of Security Assurances, again, it was key to Ukraine's decision to say, okay, we will ship those warheads back to Moscow for elimination, and we'll, and actually it ended up with a lot of American assistance, we'll, destroy the missiles and the bombers and the missile silos. But security assurances now, I think, have been hugely devalued as a potential tool in your non-proliferation toolkit. Remember, at one point in the 90s, security assurances were going to be part of the package of things for North Korea. But I can see now, if we have a future country and there's a nuclear proliferation challenge, and they talk to the Ukrainians about, how those security assurances worked out, it's not going to be a very happy picture. So I do worry that it's going to be harder to dissuade countries in the future from trying to acquire nuclear weapons if they conclude that that's essential for their security. And the kinds of assurances that we've used in the past are just going to be totally devalued by this Russian action, which is unfortunate.
Now, the war is going, I mean, I think we've even heard from Ukrainian commanders in the field making the same point you just did, Ambassador, that we don't have to win, we just don't have to lose. We just have to delay, to stall, and make them cost, which they've been doing a very good job at. But today, we're already beginning to see a potential for the war perhaps escalating. There was the bombing, the shelling outside of Lviv, for the first time really in the West. We've heard him rattle the nuclear saber. And there's been questions. I think that Jake Sullivan had a good point. When the Russians start accusing the Ukrainians of possibly using biological or chemical warfare, they might be thinking about it themselves. How do you see that potential?
First of all, I
and
think,
for that matter, including in that too, a out-and-out conflict with NATO.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me start. I mean, on the chemical and biological thing, I think it was good for the US government and the British government to get out and talking about these things. Because again, my belief is if chemical weapons would be used, the Russians would use it to create this horrific incident and try to blame the Ukrainians. So the extent that this is out in public, again, I think it takes away the Russian ability to use that as a pretext. So I think that's a positive thing. I mean, in terms of what Russia is going to do, I guess I still think the Russians still have a lot of conventional power to bring to bear. And this will sound strange, but in the first couple of weeks, the Russians have actually been somewhat restrained. My worry is that particularly as frustration and impatience in the Kremlin grows, that the Russian army will play to its strength, and its strength tends to be artillery. A typical Russian, brigade is going to have 3 to 4 times as many artillery pieces as an American counterpart. And what I worry about is you start beginning to see what you're seeing now in Mariupol, just continued bombardment. And I go back to the nightmare that was Grozny in the Second Chechen War,
Yes.
where the Russians just sat outside the city and day and night pummeled it with artillery shells and just knocked the whole city down. And that's how they basically beat it. Now, would they do that to Kyiv, or Kharkiv? I don't know, but they seem to be moving in that direction to Mariupol. And that's really my fear, where escalation, it'll remain conventional, but it's going to ratchet this war up to, you're going to see many times more civilian deaths, a lot more destruction. But at the end of the day, it may not actually help them to obtain their military objectives. Now, on NATO versus Russia, my guess is that there's a bit of a risk. I mean, certainly while there's a lot of military activity going on, Russia, of course, with their military in Ukraine, and you've got NATO reinforcing its eastern flank. But NATO has been very clear. Some people would argue even too clear about saying we are not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. And I think that NATO is pretty solid on that, because they understand how quickly that war could spill out of control. And in some ways, that could actually make the war, I think, even worse for Ukraine, because then Putin sees this as it really is kind of the manifestation of his, most paranoid fantasy fear that the United States and the West join with Ukraine to try to topple him. And then this war for him becomes even more existential. And at that point, I don't know what he does in Ukraine, but I think it could get layers worse. But right now, at least, as long as NATO and the United States are sort of staying out in that sense, we're certainly doing other things like pumping in all the weapons that we can. I think the Russians also have an incentive not to get into a conflict now with NATO, because bear in mind, the Battalion Tactic Group, which is sort of their organizing army structure, about 70% of the Battalion Tactic Groups now are fighting in Ukraine. And probably in total, about over 50% of the ground force power is now in Ukraine. They, don't really have then a lot of extra resources to take on NATO, particularly at a time where I would assume somebody sensible in the Kremlin would say, this is how we're underperforming against Ukraine. Again, and just the example, I mean, had you had that miles-long convoy sitting there for 6 or 7 days in the NATO-Russia conflict, that convoy would be, it would be visited on a nightly basis by A-10s and all kinds of planes, and it would just be pummeled. So my guess is the Russian generals, if Putin asked, would say the last thing they want right now is a conflict with NATO, because their hands are full.
I was just going to say too that the other thing, I share your pessimism on what could happen if this keeps going south militarily. We also have, along with Grozny, we also have the Syrian example. And the Russians have not really employed that much bombing. I mean, they've kept their Air Force. I think in part because, quite frankly, they don't have that as many experienced trained pilots, and they don't want to lose the planes. But even so, were they to do that, when we see it, what they did in Syria to help the Assad regime, it could be horrific. I mean,
I think that's right. But you're right, that has been, I mean, there have been several mysteries about the performance of the Russian military. One is, despite the fact that they had an Air Force that was many times larger than the Ukrainian Air Force, we're now 3 weeks into the conflict. They don't dominate the skies over Ukraine. And the Air Force, in many cases, they haven't been flying that much. And they seem to be dropping a lot of dumb bombs. I mean, the Russians had demonstrated, I think, some competence in Syria. Not always, but sometimes they were able to drop precision-guided munitions. They don't seem to be using them that much in this conflict. And as a result, their planes have to fly low, and that puts them in the range of the Stinger. And you've seen even things like the Sukhoi 34, which has only been in service now 4 or 5 years. Those are getting shot out of the skies over Ukraine.
Yes, I recall that back in the height of the Cold War, when the Pentagon would go up to the Hill and testify on the might of the Soviet military. And every once in a while, one of the senators or congressmen would ask, well, yes, General, but would you trade? And the answer was always no.
Yeah.
Let me just, we're going to turn it over to the audience in the question, but just, and I have many more questions, love to, but I want to get the audience a chance. One final one just before we do, and that is, how's it going to end? I mean, it's almost an absurd question, but how do you see it?
I guess let me give you three scenarios.
Good.
Scenario number one is that the Russians militarily defeat the Ukrainian military, which, if you look at numbers and equipment and all that, the Russian military should win. But, war's not just about numbers. It's also about determination and courage and tenacity. And the Ukrainians are showing that they've got that in bucket loads. So that's why I say, it's still an if question. It's not a when question. But let's say the Russians militarily win. They occupy the eastern 2/3 of Ukraine. I think they're going to stay out of the west in ground forces. They take Kyiv, they depose the government, and they install a pro-Russian
sort of up to the Dnieper.
Roughly that, yeah. Or maybe east of a line from Kyiv down to Odessa.
Okay, yeah.
They do that. That pro-Russian government is not going to last 2 minutes after the Russian army leaves. So they're setting themselves up for a years or decades long occupation of a population that's nationalistic, angry, hostile, in some cases armed, that I believe will be resisting both passively and peacefully. As you see in Kherson, the one city the Russians have captured, there's these, thousands of people go out almost every day with Ukrainian flags and chant, Domoy, go home, go home. And there'll be passive resistance. There will be, people won't collaborate. But I think there's also, you'll see the fight will shift to there will be violent resistance. My guess is there's a lot of AK-47s that would be coming out of, from under the floorboards and things like that. So it's going to be expensive for those. Second, it'll be political isolation. And as long as they're occupying, these sanctions stay on. And again, I've seen sort of three projections. One projection is that the Russian economy will contract 7% this year because of the sanctions. Another one said, no, it's going to contract 15%. We'll see. But there's going to be a lot of, I think, economic pain for Russia. So that's the scenario if they win. And that's where I have a hard time understanding Putin's goal here, because if they win, that seems to me to be, that's a losing game for Russia. The second scenario is, and the one I hope for, and is probably the most optimistic, is that the Kremlin really does come to its senses and say, okay, we've got to end this. Let's find a way that we can leave gracefully. And maybe it's some neutrality, maybe we won't force the Ukrainians to acknowledge, Crimea. We can leave that as an issue that they can talk about, but we really know it's going to stay. And the advantage that the Kremlin does have is because of their control of the information space in Russia, they can portray that as a victory. And then maybe they pick up on the offers that they had from the US and NATO back in January for arms control and transparency and risk reduction measures that actually would make a genuine contribution to European security, including to Russia's security. So they could put together a package that would allow them to leave with honor. I think most of the rest of the world would say they lost, but it would allow them to get out and basically then stop this horrific killing. The middle scenario is that the Russian military, and it's interesting, people a lot smarter about military things than I am, sort of say there's only a couple more weeks before the army the phrase I'd never heard before is called culminate, where it just reaches that point where the military just says it can't do anything, that morale is so shredded. And you're already seeing all kinds of reports of the Ukrainians coming across tanks and armored personnel carriers and vehicles carrying surface missiles in perfectly good order. They've just been abandoned, like the crews just walked away. Does the army just kind of break down, and then you have this stalemate where the Russians are kind of holding the territory that they've grabbed so far, which I really don't like the maps you see in most papers because they show these big swatches of Ukrainian territory captured. No, the Russians have captured roads and a few cities. And what the Ukrainians have done is they basically let the Russians in some case pass, and they're focusing a lot of attention on attacking the supply convoys, because you don't need such a powerful weapon. They're trucks, they're not armored. And if you can stop the flow of ammunition and fuel and food, you can stop the army. But so does it just kind of, the Russians stay in place and there's continued fighting, but neither side's making much progress. And then how long does that go on? So that might be the middle scenario, the ugly scenario. So I guess those would be the sort of three cases I would see. I very much hope that in the Kremlin, they come around and you can actually get a negotiation end the war, because this is a huge tragedy for Ukraine, but it's also a tragedy for a lot of Russians. I mean, if the Defense Department is right, and I think they tend to be pretty careful, 7,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in action now in Ukraine. That's going to be a tragedy for a lot of Russian families. And bear in mind, if that number is correct, Russia's lost in 3 weeks in Ukraine half as many troops as the Soviets lost in 10 years in Afghanistan.
Right. Well, I think in any case, what you're saying, and I certainly agree, is that it ain't over till it's over, but it's not going to be over for quite a while.
Yeah, and regardless of how it ends, I mean, I don't see, again, the Russians can at home portray whatever outcome as a victory. I look at all three of those outcomes and I say, how does Russia win in those three? Russia's going to come out, I think, dramatically weaker in each case.
Right. Well, let's, I know we probably have some questions from the audience. Veronica, do you want to step in? Here we go.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lindberg and Ambassador Pfeiffer, for an amazing conversation. We have a lot of audience questions. So our first question is, what do you think Putin and or Russia have to gain from this conflict? Why get involved in the first place?
Okay. The Russians have given a lot of reasons. That they say it's about NATO enlargement. I don't believe that. They say it's about genocide. There's no evidence for that. They say that they're neo-Nazis running around Ukraine. I think this is all kind of a lot of BS to justify the unjustifiable. I would argue that there, I think, are three reasons why the Russians have gone into Ukraine. One was geopolitical. Moscow wants to have Ukraine in a Russian sphere of influence where Ukraine defers to Moscow on big issues of both foreign and domestic policy. And they're concerned that Ukraine is almost irretrievably lost, which I believe is true. But I would argue that nothing has done more than Russian policy in the last 8 years to push Ukraine away, to push Ukraine towards the West. The second thing I believe, and this is really about domestic politics within Russia, but for the Kremlin, a Western-oriented, democratic, and economically successful Ukraine is a nightmare, because that's going to cause Russian citizens to say, why do we have this autocracy here? Why can't we have the same political voice and the same democratic rights they have in Ukraine? So in that sense, this is about regime survival for the Kremlin. And then the third factor is Vladimir Putin. I mean, he just brings this view of Ukraine that, again, he wrote a 7,000-word essay and described a history of Ukraine that I think very few historians would agree with. But he seems to have taken hold of this, and that's driving a lot of what the Kremlin is doing. It's the unfortunate whims of one man.
Our next question is about China. Apparently, Joe Biden called the president of China this morning and said that it was successful. Can we expect China to get more involved in this conflict? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think that remains to be seen. China has been reluctant to criticize Russia, so the Chinese have not voted always with Russia at the UN, but they've abstained. But the Chinese, I think, are thoroughly uncomfortable about this. First of all, whatever was said between President Xi and Putin, China is implicated in having known about this. I mean, Putin was in China for the opening of the Olympics, had a big meeting with Putin, with President Xi, and then 3 days after the close of the Olympics, he launches the military attack. And so I think there's a lot of suspicion out there that Xi had some forewarning of this. I think Xi also has to bear in mind that he has called Putin his best friend. One of the things I assume or hope that President Biden said was, look, you have influence with Putin. You can exert some of your influence to urge him to stop this. And there may be, and I think there should be some pressure now on China. If China wants to be a responsible player in the world, and if the Chinese say, as they said today, that what's happening there, they don't want to see that war there, well, then it's incumbent on China to exert some of its influence to try to stop it. And that'll be, I think, a test for the Chinese, and we'll see how they handle it.
Thank you. Our next two questions I'm going to tie together. So first, what do you see the role of the U.S. Congress as being in pushing the Biden administration to act more forcefully? And then also, could you speak as to the bipartisan consensus that we're seeing over this issue that we really haven't seen over a lot of other issues in the U.S. Congress, and whether there's other issues related to Ukraine, maybe in the types of support that you think will have less bipartisan consensus?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Ukraine has been one of those issues that I think actually going back to the early 1990s, there's generally been support on both sides of the aisle among Republicans and Democrats. I guess I would now say mainstream Republicans. I think there's a certain Republican fringe that's emerged that is, in a few cases, totally bought into the Russian line. But I think generally there is that bipartisan support, and I think we've seen it. Although I do find it sad that there are some on the Republican side who still are kind of sniping at the administration. Now, the relationship between Congress has pushed things, and in this case, it's been not just Republicans and Democrats, but also some Democrats. And I think the administration in some cases resisted, got a lot of flack for it, but it turned out right. So for example, last year, a lot of pressure from Congress, again, from both Republicans and Democrats on the administration to sanction and kill the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that runs from Russia under the Baltic Sea to Germany. And the administration basically in May of last year said, we're not going to sanction certain entities, we're going to waive the sanctions. And that decision was made even though the administration opposed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The administration didn't want to get into a big fight with Germany, particularly after the 4 years of the previous administration, where I think US relations with Europe and US relations in particular with Germany had been badly, badly damaged. And the Biden administration was trying to repair those relations. So they said, we're not going to get into a fight with Germany now over Nord Stream 2. Now, Nord Stream 2 has been killed, but it's been killed in the right way, is the German government killed it. So sometimes there's a desire by Congress to push and make these things happen. But sometimes, I think they don't understand or they don't follow the nuance in ways that might allow their objectives to be achieved in a more positive way.
Right. I would add, I think on the imposing of the sanctions when they were said we have to go harder, faster. And I think there was a failure to recognize that we have to bring along the allies. We have to bring along the EU, and we have to bring along the NATO allies. And then we had the gift from the EU. They actually, in a couple instances, got out in front of us. And that's great. When your friends are prepared to do more than you are faster, or than you thought they would, go with it.
Yeah. And again, exactly the example you mentioned. Back in January, Congress wanted to start sanctioning Russia then. The problem with that was, to my mind, the Russian experience and the Russian perception is once an American sanction goes on, it is almost never going to come off. So had we started applying sanctions on Russia before they launched the invasion, the Russians would have totally discounted the impact of the sanctions because they would have said they'll be there regardless. Now, again, I think at the end of the day, we couldn't put together enough combination of sanctions and military assistance to Ukraine to deter Putin. I think he probably made his mind up sometime last year. But we didn't know that for sure. It became clear on February 24.
Yeah, and I would add that getting back to what the ambassador was saying earlier about this very small group, these aren't oligarchs. These aren't and I think we have been correct to hit the oligarchs. That's and hit them hard. But the problem is these guys are not the ones that are likely to suffer. And my guess is in their council with Putin, whether we had gone earlier with the sanctions or not, they would have said, look, we can ride this out and it's not going to hurt us.
Yeah.
And, so don't worry about it. Some of the rich guys might have to sell their yachts or whatever, but we'll be all right.
Yeah. But I think the real question though is, and to some extent, it's a bit regrettable, but these sanctions, I think, are really going to hit ordinary Russians very hard. I mean, the ruble value fell 40% over the last 2 months. The Russian stock markets haven't opened up now for 3 weeks. The Russians, it's almost a certainty that within a couple months, they're going to see significant inflation. And in one sense, I feel kind of bad about that. But then I also look what the Russian army is doing to Ukrainians. People I know in Ukraine, when I talk to them saying, yeah, I was woken up 10 times last night by air raids, so they're still in Kyiv and such. So I wonder, though, the combination of the impact of those sanctions on the public, and then as Russians begin to learn the scale of the number of Russians who are being killed and maimed and wounded in Ukraine, what does that do to the Russian public? And certainly it's an autocratic system that Putin's built, but they pay a lot of attention to public opinion. Right now, polls show that Russians are supportive of what Putin's doing. But as the impact comes home, I wonder if that will change.
That actually answers a couple of the questions we had about sanctions.
I'm sorry.
No, that was perfect. But on those lines, do you think there's further actions that the United States could and should take to make even more of an impact on Russians and on the Russian government?
Yeah. Well, I think there are some additional sanctions, although again, we've really, somebody once described it to me, last year on a scale of 1 to 10 on sanctions on Russia, we were about a 3. Now I think most people would say, and when you may or may not be, 8.5 and 9.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I mean, I'm not sure that we actually have to do more in terms of sanctions. The problem is,
I can't really figure out how much more we could do.
Yeah. Yeah, but the problem is some of the sanctions, the impact is not going to be immediate. It'll take in some months, or in some of the impacts. I mean, we basically blocked the export to Russia of a variety of high-tech items, including semiconductors. So when their current stocks run out, there's going to be some things that the Russians build for their civilian economy, but for the military, they simply are not going to be able to build because they don't have domestic alternatives. But that impact is going to take some time down the road. Now, the hope is that some of the people, and again, if somebody can talk to Putin and say, this is what your economy is going to look like a year from now if you don't stop this. But that conversation may not take place just because that person may not be entitled to address the inner circle.
So you think that Putin doesn't know the economic effect that this is going to have on Russia?
I'm not sure that he's gotten a good, clear explanation from economists as to what this could do to his economy. And it may have been combined with an assumption that he had that the sanctions would be significantly less than what the West did. And again, he thought he had $630 billion in foreign reserve assets and hasn't figured out, or should figure out, that half of those are gone, or at least they're still owned by the Russian central bank, but the Russian central bank can't get access to them, and it can't really use a lot of the assets it has within Russia. But again, I'm not sure whether he sat down with the head of his central bank and his Minister of Finance to say, what exactly does this mean to our economy a year from now?
Well, you remember we had that one picture in the first week after the invasion and the sanctions were going on, of the 30-foot table and all of his bankers and financial advisors way down at the other end. And if they were giving advice, it struck me as he wasn't in a listening mode. He was in a, dictating.
And the question is, when you have that opportunity to sit in the room with Mr. Putin, do you give him real advice, or do you say he's not going to want to hear this and you shade it?
Yeah.
I mean, there's, I think, a real question about how many in Russia are prepared to speak truth to power when you're talking to Vladimir Putin.
Another question that we have is about what you think this is going to do to shape the future of NATO.
Galvanized it. I mean, And the Russians started, I mean, back in 2013, and Wayne, you probably heard some of this, but the think tanks community in 2013, looking forward to the NATO summit that was planned for the summer of 2014, think tanks were getting ready to hold, conferences, panels. What's the future of NATO? I mean, NATO had sort of left behind the defend and deter attack from the Soviet Union back in the 90s. It had looked at enlargement, stabilization operations in the Balkans. Then after 9/11, it was out of area operations. So NATO had a fairly significant commitment to Afghanistan. But by 2013, you were getting the sense that NATO was deciding out of area was probably not something that they were going to do forever. And so the question, what's going to be NATO's purpose? And then the Russian military seized Crimea. They started the conflict in Donbass, and people said, hey, we figured something out. And that's only been crystallized by the last month. I mean, NATO now is really, I think, understanding that it has to have significant military capability, that as much as the French would like to see sort of a kind of a European security identity, that there's going to be a spot for the United States to play there. So I think it's given NATO a mission that's unfortunately going to be required for some time to come, because I think we're going to face a more difficult Russia for some time to come.
And I think also a key that the invasion did, and the U.S. response, and working unprecedentedly close with our allies on this. I mean, the number of meetings, a constant diplomacy that was going on in the run-up to the invasion and continues, is that it corrected, I think, the lean in NATO, or the doubts in NATO that the previous administration had introduced.
I think
where are the Americans? Can we trust them?
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to over politicize this, but when the President Biden said we're back, this really made it clear we were.
Yeah. And I mean, I think going back to December, I mean, from the president on down, they worked the phones, they traveled to Europe. I mean, how many times have Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin been to Europe in the last 2 months? And a lot of that was, really, it was the kind of the consultation that really does make NATO work well. So I think the administration deserves a huge amount of credit for making this happen. Obviously, the Europeans helped too, but I mean, they were consulting in the way that you need to consult with allies if you want to ask them to do some hard things.
And unprecedented, as the ambassador said earlier, intelligence sharing and transparency. And that, I think, countered some of the doubts that have entered into, used to be, the great story was, of course, when during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy sent Dean Acheson to talk to de Gaulle. And they walked in with his briefing, and he said, Mr. President, Acheson to de Gaulle, laid out, he said, I have pictures of the missiles in Cuba. And de Gaulle said, why do I need to see those? He said, the president told me, and I take his word. So, and proceeded. We've come a long ways from there, or we did. I think we're, in a sense, clawing our way back there on at least the intelligence side.
A lot of our students asked about the Ukrainian response and whether you, who spent several years in Ukraine, expected the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian president to fight back the way they did, and whether you think Russia expected it.
I expected it, the Russians didn't. Let me say, it just wasn't me. I was in Kyiv the last 2 days of January. And, people who are not in the military, when you said, what are you going to do if the Russians invade? I'm going to go get a gun and defend my country. And like I think I said earlier, had Putin asked Wayne or me or any former American ambassador served in Ukraine, or the 30 or 40 people in the DC think tanks who follow Ukraine closely, I think most, if not all, would have said the Ukrainians are going to fight. That's just their nature. Because I think for a lot of Ukrainians, this is an existential war. If they lose and become either, if they're annexed by Russia or become an occupied vassal state of Russia, it means the end of the democracy. And remember, Ukrainians in the Orange Revolution and the Maidan revolutions, hundreds of thousands went to the streets for a democratic system. That's important to them. And it also means they lose what I think is the motivating vision particularly for the young in Ukraine, which is they want to see Ukraine as a normal European country, like the Czech Republic or Slovenia, something like that. And they see both the democracy and that vision in Europe denied if the Russians win. So it's existential. And they're going to fight. On the Russian side, again, I think the Kremlin completely underestimated, the military operations, the way they've been conducted, really seem to suggest that they thought this was going to be a cakewalk. Soldiers sent in with 3 days of food. And the Ukrainians, I mean, they've published these, these are security cameras in stores showing Russian soldiers breaking into grocery stores and stripping the shelves of food because, they had 3 days of food. The Russians clearly had an assumption about how quickly this war is that suggests to me they did not properly assess the capabilities of their adversary and the motivations of their adversary.
We also got a lot of questions about Putin's mental state. And we have two types of questions. First, what drives him to want this conflict? And also, are we overestimating the importance of Putin's mental and psychological state as opposed to the geopolitical benefits of invading Ukraine, and which one was actually more impactful in causing this conflict?
Yeah. Well, again, I think for Putin, as I described, there's a geopolitical reason to try to bring Ukraine back. There's this domestic reason is for Putin and the Kremlin inner circle, having a democratic, successful Ukraine next door is not a good thing. And then again, it's Putin's own particular, vision of what Ukraine is. This idea that sort of Russia is really Russia plus Ukraine, or most of Ukraine and Belarus. So I think that's what's driving him. Those three factors. Plus, and a little bit is of the West. I mean, Putin, says it so much, I fear he's come to believe his own propaganda that the West is out to get him. So there's something of that there. I don't think Putin's crazy, but I do worry that he's perhaps not as rationally calculating as he was, say, 15 years ago or 10 years ago. And that's just because he just seems more emotional. I mean, there's been some speculation. Let me say, I'm not a doctor, so take this with a big qualifier, but some people notice, I mean, physically his appearance does seem to be different, that his face seems puffier. And some doctors say, well, that could be a consequence of steroid use if he's got some health issue. And apparently one effective steroid is to make you feel a little bit more aggressive. So that might be a factor again, but those are rumors out there. Nobody who I know has had a chance to actually physically examine Putin or look at his medical records, so we just don't know. So I don't think he's crazy, but again, there's some factor there that's he's not doing, to my mind, the correct calculation of the cost and the benefits of his action, because, again, as I said, the three scenarios I see all look to me to be losers for Russia.
There's been a lot of debate about to what extent the U.S. should get militarily involved in the conflict. Do you think the U.S. is justified in holding back military aid, or should it do more?
Yeah, well, I think it's the right thing not to get involved in the sense of the U.S. military fighting the Russian military, which is why I think it's sensible not to do a no-fly zone over Ukraine, because I think that quickly spirals out into a conventional war, and then you have to really start thinking about nuclear scenarios. So I think that's the line to draw: is no U.S. NATO forces fighting directly against the Russians. But what it does seem to be, and I wrote an article about a week ago for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, there's some tacit rules that have sort of developed here, where it seems to be fair game for the United States to pump a lot of weapons in to Ukraine. And the president's speech, I mean, he's going to send 1,000 or 2,000 more Javelin anti-tank missiles, more Stinger missiles, going to help out the Ukrainians to get some more capability against higher altitude targets, sending these Switchblade kamikaze drones, a lot of stuff going in that will give the Ukrainians significant capability. And that seems to be acceptable within the rules of the game. I think there's quite a bit of intelligence sharing. If you look at these radar flight trackers that are on the internet, you'll see that every day there are US, British, NATO aircraft flying along Poland, along Romania, that are looking into Ukraine and looking at what's above Ukraine and looking at what's around Ukraine. And my guess is a fair amount of that information, I don't know, I'm not in the government anymore, but some of that information is being passed on to the Ukrainians so that they can better organize their military defense. And again, that seems to be within the rules. Now, where it gets a little bit difficult is sometimes we're not quite sure where those rules end, what's acceptable. And I think the fiasco, and it was badly handled, I think, by the European Union and Poland. And this was the one big misstep of the US government, this question of getting MiG-29s to the Ukrainians. There should not have been 10 days of public debate. It should have been quiet, and then one day just some 30 extra MiGs show up in Ukraine. But I think one of that issues there was a sense on the West that, we see that the Russians, surely they don't like it, but they seem to accept we're doing Stingers and Javelins and similar weapons, but a sense per that does the MiG-29s cross the line where that might then trigger some Russian action against NATO. So there's a lot that we can do, but I don't think you're going to see NATO forces fighting against the Russians unless somebody makes a really horrendous mistake.
Well, those were all of our questions. On behalf of LMU, we want to thank
Veronica,
yes, go ahead.
As we close, I had one remaining question, if I could.
Yes, please.
And I also wanted to thank the ambassador. And that final question is, in the past, crises like this, maybe not as immense, but certainly had silver linings over the long run. I mean, arguably, the Cuban Missile Crisis led to greater interest and I think desire for strategic arms control. 1956, the Hungarian and the 68 Prague can be argued led eventually to the creation of the OSCE. Do you have any hope that the current crisis could do the same? If so, what might we do now to realize that hope?
Yeah. I think it's going to be hard. I mean, I think you can see some things. I mean, first of all, I mean, this is, sometimes we talk about it analytically, but I mean, this is a huge tragedy for Ukraine. I mean, thousands of Ukrainians have been killed, immense damage done to infrastructure and cities and residents and industrial structures. It'll take Ukraine a long time to recover from this. And this was a war that Ukrainians did not deserve. They did nothing to justify to merit this kind of attack from Russia. So I think that's going to take a while. I think you're going to see a more galvanized West, a West that is more concerned about Russia and that works to make sure that the Russians don't miscalculate with regards to how hard, for example, NATO would fight to defend itself. I think an interesting question is the Finland and Sweden. In the last two big NATO meetings, the in-person foreign ministers meeting, I think a week ago, and the virtual summit that NATO held 2 weeks ago, it wasn't just NATO. In both cases, the Finns and the Swedes were invited. Do they finally decide that neutrality needs to be abandoned because they want the security of NATO? And they can make really important contributions. So I think you're going to see a more galvanized West, courtesy of what the Russians have done. I also wonder about what this does to the Russian-Chinese relationship. I mean, because, again, Xi has kind of tied himself to Putin. And if it begins to look like Putin is a loser, does Xi decide that he needs to loosen those bonds and maybe move more quickly to a more balanced stance between Russia and Ukraine? I don't know, but I think that's a question out there that people smarter than me about China should be watching. Sometimes, as you said, Wayne, I think in the past, the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, it set off kind of a wave of arms control. And after the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, that set off, the Helsinki Final Act. I'm just not sure. I guess I worry that it's going to take a while. I mean, the Biden administration, I believe, came to office with a fairly ambitious agenda for arms control. And personally, I think arms control can make a real contribution to US security. But I think arms control now has been set back for quite a while. Because even if the conflict ended tomorrow, there's going to be some period before you can get back to the strategic stability dialogue and actually get negotiations underway. And the clock's going to run out before you get to an election season in 2024. And that's not the time to ask the Senate to look at treaties for ratification purposes. So I think some things that could have been useful for American security and even for Russian security aren't going to get done just because of the timing issue. Now, there will be I guess the last point I make, that there will be a question, what kind of European security architecture can you build at this point? And that might be a conversation worth having, including with the Russians when things settle down. But it just seems to me that the views of the participating countries, the United States, Europe, Russia, Ukraine, are going to be so at odds. It'll take a long while for that thing to, if you get that discussion going, to produce something that could be meaningful.
Thank you. Veronica, back to you. Sorry to have interrupted you.
No, not at all. Well, I just wanted to thank both you, Dr. Limburg and Ambassador Pfeiffer, on behalf of LMU for taking the time to share your perspective with our LMU community on such an important event.
Thank you very much for having me. I regret that I have to leave for something else, but good luck with the rest of your discussion.
Thank you. And yes, we can clap.
Okay, thank you.
And so we're going to have a short intermission and then come back at 3:40 for a panel on the voices from Ukraine and perspectives from Russia.
Very good.
Thank you again.
Intermission.
Okay, Wayne, thanks for a good conversation. Thank you. Great questions. And I
Well,
hope it did what you hoped to do.
thanks very, very much. That was great. It was I think they got a lot out of it. We'll hear down the line. Yeah,
Okay,
thanks
great.
for taking the time.
Sure, happy to do it. Have a good weekend.
Okay, you too.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. This is the second half of the event on Ukraine. There's a little bit of
What is it?
and I think we'll start with you, Leah. So if you'd like to get started and introduce yourself, and then we can talk about the ground level in Ukraine and Russian perspectives from a little more closer into the region.
Sure. And I'd like to start with a PowerPoint, which is going to help me out to introduce myself. So, hello, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for coming here. Before I start, I would like to thank LMU community for finding time, for finding space, for finding your energy to come here, and particularly Luke, who have been fundamental in making this happen and have helped to hold an event at UCLA about a couple of weeks ago. We had something not similar, but thematically close to what is happening here. And it's wonderful to come back to LMU. I used to be an instructor here when I graduated from UCLA. and I miss some of you. It's a wonderful space, and I will share with you a few things today about what is happening, primarily sharing with you perspectives of my friends who have been incredibly kind and supportive of me telling you what I'll be sharing with you today. And this is the way in which I actually imagine my own role today. So I will start, and I'll just share with you some, some visuals. And where you don't see the copyright things, these are just pictures from my friends. So this is a Ukrainian map, and this is the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, right? And my family is from Siberia, but I, for complicated family reason, grew up in Cherkasy, and this is the place where I grew up. I went to school in Kiev, got my first library degree in Kiev, and after I left, I've left a lot of friends back there. And while I don't have a family in Ukraine anymore, my dad died last February. I have friends who are like my extended family, and these friends are in Cherkasy. These friends are in Kiev. These friends are in Lviv at the moment, and I'll share with you a picture from Lviv in a moment, from a friend of mine who's there, one of the multiple internally displaced persons. She's there, as well as I have a very close, my best friend. She's like my sister. She's from Nizhyn, and this is where Nizhyn is located. It's Chernigovskaya Oblast. If we need to look at the map of the current warfare, we can just, I don't know if you have seen that, just to picture where the fighting is happening at the moment and the proximity of the cities to the region of fighting. We can do that. So I'll do it right now, actually, just to, so this is the map that sort of show where everything is. So this is the capital, and the there's a lot of, what is going on in Kiev, and people who are in Kiev at the moment, they hear the shooting at the moment, and a friend of mine says to me, они постреливают, which means they continue shooting here and there, but not that the city is not getting shelled very heavily. So Chernigovskaya region, it's sort of like northern part, I can do it, is being heavily, and Nizhyn, which is the city where my friend is from, has been surrounded, not that the city itself, but surrounding parts of it. And there is another city that we will talk about today, is Kharkov, and Kharkov is, let me just move this and you'll see where Kharkov is located. Kharkov is right here. It's very close to the Russian borders. This is where Kharkov is located. It's a primarily Russian-speaking city, and I have my schoolmate actually went there, and I'll show a picture of him. So he back at Cherkasy, because the city was completely destroyed. So Kharkov is Russian borders. Chernigov is right here, so it's also quite close. Lviv is close to the Polish borders. A lot of Polish organizations help out, but they have sirens here and there, but it's not, as close to the fighting lines as, as Nizhyn, for example, or proximity of Kiev. And Cherkasy, where my family is safe, is fine. So this is just to keep us, on the same plane where everything is happening. So go back to the map, and I'm gonna just share with you some of the pictures that my friends share. So this one is from Lviv, and my friend who is in Lviv at the moment, she lived in Kiev, but right now she's with her family there. And this is the picture of the same event that is happening at the moment. This is the pictures from today. And it's a memorial that the city government is doing for the 109 children who, this is the official number of children who have been killed in the past 3 weeks. And each life of a child is represented by the empty child carriage. And this is the market square in Lviv. Next pictures, I'm gonna just move to the next slide. Comes from the very start of war, and the picture on the right is actually from one of the official news sources. Picture on the left is from a friend of mine who's at the moment defending Kiev. We communicate once in a while, and I don't know if you followed the news or not, but during the first days of wars, there was a there was a search for saboteurs, people who tried to, and in Kiev, on the first days of war, 60 saboteurs were captured, and they were shot on the
Freedom Square.
Victory Square, on the Victory Square in Kiev. So this is captured, and this picture actually captures the capturing of the saboteurs. But this one is a truck, and it says hell in Russian and in Ukrainian on the truck. So this is the picture where they take the saboteurs and bring them to the place of an execution. And I don't want to comment on it. I was a little bit shocked by this sharing of the news of what is happening in the capital. And this is, first days of war. And the next one is gonna be a tribute to the history department. This comes from Nizhyn, and the fightings around Nizhyn had been quite heavy in a couple of weeks. And people moved from Nizhyn. So this is the picture of the person from Nizhyn who died. He didn't die defending Nizhyn. He actually died defending a village not far from Kiev, but he is from Nizhyn. And what the city officials decided to do on March 11th is to rename the Moscow Street to be named after this person who defended the homeland. And he was a military official trained who actually participated in defending the country since 2013. And this is the picture of the funeral of this person in Nizhyn very recently. So with this, I'd like us to just take a moment of silence for the people who fell, and just a few moments, we do it by minute of silence. And the numbers that I'm sharing with you at the moment again come from my friend who is in Kiev, and on the top the numbers of the Ukrainian casualties, and the number is not very clear. It's between 2,000 or 4,000 with close to 400 civilian deaths, but this number is not something that is well advertised in the Ukrainian official press. But on the bottom, Ukrainska Pravda, it's the official Ukrainian news source, continuously updates on the casualties from the Russian side. And at the moment, that was today that a friend of mine shared with me. So this is 23rd day of war, over 14,000 people, Russian soldiers officially, and 1,000 polonenic, the captured soldiers. So these are the numbers that the Ukrainian official news source with the rest, with the planes and the helicopters, everything. So with that, I move back to the map just to move you to a different place in the on the map, Kamenets-Podolsky, which is a place right here in the circle. And this is where a friend of mine from Nizhyn, and Nizhyn is right here, who actually lived not far from Boyarka. We'll see her actually in the next segment of the today's event, came, and a lot of her neighbors came, and this is the segment from Kamenets-Podolsky. This is a beautiful historical city. So they sent me the pictures. So we see what Kamenets-Podolsky look like. It has a lot of internally displaced persons at the moment in this city. So you see a friend of mine, we went to school with my sister, and a friend of her is actually doing what a lot of civilians are at the moment engaged with. They help in the army and they help in the war from the civilian side. So they making the yellow and blue slings. And these slings, the military forces put in their arms, whether on the yellow side or on the blue side. So when you look at the news, you might see those slings on some of the fighters. And the ways in which the slings work, as they explained to me, it's for recognition purposes, as well as for the purposes of signaling, like a signaling devices. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but these are the slings that the civilians at the moment making to support the army. This is another thing, and this is the family of this woman. It's 12 of them actually in this house, and what they making, a lot of people are making this. This is camouflage net. So it's like a large net, and the factory that makes military uniforms throws out the leftovers from the military uniform given to civilians. And they put this little, they cut little stripes of this leftover fabric and put on this camouflage net, and then the net goes to the military to keep the, to camouflage the military equipment. So it's quite large, and this picture actually allows to see how large this net is and how much work goes into it. So that's the finished product, and this is what they did actually for a week. They worked on the net for a week, and this is the pile of slings that they've made. This is the slide on the left, comes from my hometown. Forgive me if I'm a little emotional looking at this picture for like 5th time, trying not to cry. It says on the jar. So this is a jar with canned meat, and the canned meat is sent to the military troops. And on the canned meat it says, любий воїне, прошу повернути банку особисто. Чекаємо тебе у школі 17 міста Черкаси, which from Ukrainian translates, dear warrior, we ask you to specifically return this can to the school 17 in town of Черкаси, which on the top, and they share it using Telegram application, which is actually owned by Russian oligarch. Very strange thing that people using it for various kind of purposes, and it's very, it's very prominent source of communication. But on the top it says "Повертайтеся живими, благаємо," which means come back alive, we ask you. So it's very emotional. It's just very emotional, and you cannot be not emotional when it. Anyway, on the right, this is the bad picture, but it's the only picture that I've got from my schoolmate Koval Sergey. He's from Kharkov. All the people are from Kharkov. They're all totally displaced at the moment. He sent to me a question if we can send a little bit of money to help them out. They have all friends. So this is also somebody I went to school with in Cherkasy and who was in Kiev, and everything was just, yeah. He sent me a very moving video of his son's university being bombed. Pardon this if you can speak or read Russian. This is something that became after the Snake Island event. This became something that people use as to show the Russian army the direction, whether it so this is a sign on the road, and it says like, if you go straight, go yourself. If you go that, it says again, fuck yourself. And then this way is Russia, and same thing. So this is like from the early days of the war. This one on the right from my hometown, and it says Russian military, it's in Russian military ship, tank, soldier, go, same thing. And this one is from Kiev. This is Maidan, a few days ago actually, and it says Russian ship in Russian. So this is something that you see everywhere. You see it on the uniform. So this is like a slogan, I would say, something that unifies people, helps express all kind of emotional, and it's something that is very Ukrainian actually. At least this is what it sounds to me like, because I'm from an agricultural town, so I totally just get it as a way in which people speak. And this is the other thing that I wanted to share. It really communicates well with me, and it's an interesting. It was a video at the beginning of the wars when a tractor pulled a tank, abandoned tank. So you see that video being repeated as the tractor pulling Kremlin. That's one of what meme, yeah, thing that you see. And Ukraine it's an agricultural land. So these kind of images are also speak a lot as a part of the Ukrainian part of what Ukrainian culture is a lot about. So you see the whole set of images actually associated with the land, with like cultivating land, with the fields. And the story was in New York Times about the seeds in the soldier's pocket that would grow into soняшники, the sunflowers. This one, I like this one a lot. It's very fun. I actually seen somebody make a big art out of this. And then, then the Kremlin is also pulled by the tractor. So I will stop here because my 15 minutes, I guess, is over. But the second part, you'll actually see some of the people about whom I talked here, and yeah. So
Thank you, Yulia.
Sure.
That was very interesting and emotional. It's hard to deal with. I've spent a lot of time lately watching Ukrainian news, and it's just heartbreaking. And I would also recommend, and I think this was showed in the Congress when Zelensky spoke, but it's certainly available on Ukrainian websites. It's the video showing Ukraine that he tried to sort of, I suppose, pitch to show the American Congress, and it's so emotional, and it shows you all the good sides of Ukraine and how quickly that was ripped apart by the war, and it's done very well. So it's a very emotional thing. So I had one quick question: is Kirill on? Do we have Kirill on the internet, or does he have an internet connection problem?
I think that
Yeah, I'm here.
Right now, I think he's not.
Okay.
Is that correct, Luke?
I'm here.
Yeah.
Okay, so then what should I go ahead? Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
So I'll go ahead because we're waiting for Kirill Havarun, who
I am here.
he is in Barcelona right now, and just recently with his family evacuated from Ukraine, and he is the acting head of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at LMU. And so he comes from a very there he is. Well, let me just, then what I said is just an introduction for him, and then he can get to speak. But Sergey, he's the head of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University, and comes from a religious and theological perspective. And if you think of the role of the church today, we wanted to bring that to the fore in Ukraine, and also because there were some major events with the Ukrainian church getting independence, its own patriarchy in the Eastern Orthodox Church only a few years back. So it's been a very turbulent time for the Ukrainian National Church, and we were hoping that Kirill could speak to that and join us now from Barcelona to talk to us about his perspectives on Ukraine. So welcome, Kirill. Thank you for being with us.
Hello. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
No, we
Can
can't
you hear
hear
me? It should be fine.
Or I can't hear you.
Can you?
Real, can you possibly unplug your, if you have headphones?
Oh, Zoom can hear.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
yeah,
let me.
Jill, you can keep talking. I guess.
Yeah,
it's
can
just
you
us
hear me?
here, or
Because
us
it should
can't
be.
hear.
It worked before we started, actually.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Now it's better,
No, we
right?
can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thank you for having me with you. Yes, and I'm glad to also to meet Yulia. Actually, I'm glad that you studied in the school number 17 in Cherkasy. I'm from Cherkasy myself, and my brother studied in the school number 17th. He has signed up now. He is in a military unit protecting his land, and as many other people in Ukraine. And as the Ambassador Pfeiffer said it, it's like a momentum for consolidation of the entire country, this war. And the total of the Ukrainian society has never been so consolidated, so unanimous as it is now. Yes, indeed, I would like to bring up the religious dimension to this war. I think it is really deficient to look at this war without taking into consideration this dimension. I would even say that, you know, in a sense, the Russian aggression against Ukraine is similar to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which was unpredicted by the American intelligence community. You know, people were taken by surprise by that war because they tended to see, you know, the world history from the secular perspective as just a chain of, you know, of interests connected with one another, which are pragmatic, like economic, political, whatever, but not religious. And then this theocratic revolution in Iran happened. And I think to some extent, it may also explain the seemingly irrational behavior of Putin. Has been said today that he acts like an irrational person. Yes, he's very pragmatic. Yes, he is very much kind of has different interests on his mind. And yet he seems to act against his interests, against the pragmatism for which he's famous. You know, they used to have a joke about the Russian regime under Putin, that Putin's regime believes in three things. One thing is money. Second thing is money. Guess what is the third thing, you know, that they believe? And now he seems to go against this rationale. So what is the rationale? And I believe you cannot really understand it without taking into consideration this religious kind of underpinning. And in one of his recent sermons, the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, indicated that this war, well, kind of, they don't call it war, they call it special operation or just an operation. This kind of operation has a metaphysical dimension. That is probably the only point in which I disagree with the Patriarch, that indeed it does have a metaphysical dimension, at least in the minds of those who wage it. Certainly for Putin, his obsession with Ukraine has to do with his, you know, historiosophy, his philosophical outlook at the history, his even kind of metaphysical perception of history. In a sense, I would argue that Putin's perception of history is Hegelian. He sees, you know, some hidden powers behind the timeline, and he tries to figure out what kind of powers are they. And certainly he connects those powers with, you know, with religion. So he is Hegelian in his perception of history. Yes, he is very amateurish. And as it has been indicated, his take on history, on the Ukrainian history, cannot stand any criticism from, you know, any serious historian. And yet his amateurish perception of history indeed underlines the entire action that he pursues in Ukraine. I would argue that Putin's kind of driving force or Putin's interest is a sort of historical perspective in which he places himself at some prominent place. So essentially, I would say that Putin envisages a handbook in history of Russia. And he makes this history as if from the perspective of himself, kind of being described on the pages of this handbook in the future. And he somehow enacts his vision of the history and his place in the history. I hope you get what I try to say, that his look at his own action is not direct, but retrospective from the future handbooks of history upon kind of looking upon himself. And this is a completely imagined construct in his head. He has already written this handbook of history, and he just performs according to this handbook. And certainly he sees his mission as historical, as a messianic even. And Ukraine is pretty much in the center of his messianic vision. I should say that he is now realizing that he has completely failed in writing this handbook of history. He is starting to realizing that probably the future handbooks of history will describe him as a monster, similar like to Hitler or Mussolini, you know, all those monsters of the past. And this is probably the greatest tragedy that he is either facing or he's going to face if he survives. So one thing that drives him is this metaphysical Hegelian perception of history, as I said. Another thing I believe is a Manichaean dualistic perception of the role of Russia in the world history. Yes, I would argue that Putin has not a kind of an ordinary, not a conventional political outlook at the history. He looks at it in the terms, as I said, as I mentioned, it was also mentioned by the Patriarch, metaphysical terms. And this metaphysics is not healthy. It's unhealthy. It's unorthodox because it is based on the dichotomization of the world, on this dualistic perception of the world. Essentially, I believe how Putin reads the history. He looks at it and how he perceives the world. He sees the world as being divided into black and white, into a sort of essential goodness and essential evilness. For him, Russia embodies, you know, the essential goodness of the world. It's like metaphysically, ontologically good, and it stands against what Putin perceives as something metaphysically bad, as something evil, which for him is embodied, you know, in the United States, in NATO, in the West in general. And in his view, I believe, there is a cosmic battle, if you want. Well, it looks like, it sounds strange in our times, but I believe that it kind of describes his worldview. That's how I think it's possible to read his mind, that he looks at the world history as a cosmic battle between the, you know, intrinsic ontological goodness represented by Holy Russia and the intrinsic evilness of the West. That is kind of another aspect, metaphysical aspect, that may help us understand better probably Putin's mind and his motivation. And the last thing that I think explains his mind is also global, and it has to do with what we describe as culture wars. It's essentially about it's about the ideological divide, ideological differentiation between the so-called liberals and conservatives. Those culture wars are particularly acute in the United States, as we know. And I sometimes explain to my students also at LMU that culture wars are not about culture, nor they about wars. But what happened in Russia, I believe, is that Putin managed to make a culture war a real war. For him, this culture war is something that he stands for. He protects, as you know, the so-called traditional values, and he tries to pioneer, to spearhead, you know, the conservative agenda globally, which makes him an attractive figure, even a hero in some circles, including in the United States, especially, you know, in some white evangelical circles or in the conservative Catholic circles. Among the Muslims, I just read a statement by the Muslim community of Russia that completely endorsed Putin on the basis that he is justified to fight against the global evil of the West, which fits very well into the rhetoric of Daesh and radical Islam. So essentially, Putin plays a role of a kind of champion of the traditional values versus liberalism and corruption, moral corruption of the West, and that is pretty much his kind of ideological agenda, which is underpinned by religious views. So I would say that Putin is metaphysically concerned. He has some religious underpinnings. Well, he identifies himself, of course, as an Orthodox Christian, and his agenda, which includes those traditional values and fighting the West and this dualistic dichotomization, all of them together make him a popular figure among most Russians. And this is a truth also that, yes, I see the tendency in the Western media to stress the difference between Putin and the Russian people, but the fact is that the majority of the Russians still support Putin. I believe they support him because of his rhetoric, because of his references to the metaphysics. Well, let me conclude with probably the final kind of assessment that I would make about him. Yes, he identifies himself as an Orthodox Christian. He makes references, rhetorical, tropes to this identity, Orthodox identity, to popular beliefs, religious beliefs. At the same time, I believe he's profoundly unorthodox in a bad sense. He's a heretic. He distorts Christianity. He abuses it. He instrumentalizes it. And his main abuse of Christianity is that he makes religion politicized. We are talking about the ideology substituting theology, and that is, I think, a task for the theologians, if you wish, or people who work in the sphere of public theology, of political theology, to deconstruct this kind of ideologized theology. I call it, and I kind of make this appeal in the academic circles, we need a deputinization of theology, as we need the deputinization of the Russian church, and I believe we need also a wider deputinization of the Russian society. That would be my final plea in this conversation. Thank you for your attention. Nigel, I think you need to unmute yourself, otherwise we cannot hear you.
Are we good? Thank you, Kirill, for those words. And just the connection, talking about the connection between Putin and the Orthodox Church, it has been very, very tight for the last few years, and it's got tighter and tighter. And so that is a concern for anybody who thinks, I suppose, the American separation of church and state, that there's a deep concern there. So thank you so much, Kirill. From my perspective now, I'd like to talk about Russia and Russia domestically, because I know, most of our concerns are in Ukraine, because that is where the horrors are. And listening to Yulia talk so emotionally, one of the things to think about in Russia is, if you're in Novosibirsk, if you're in Irkutsk, this war is thousands of miles away. It's very, very distant. And so even in Moscow, if you saw the image at the Luzhniki football stadium where they held a rally with 50,000 people, they're having a party because this football stadium is not going to be bombed. You have the first reports coming out, and mothers who are starting to hear that their children have, their 18, 19, 20-year-old boys have been killed in war. And those are starting to cause trauma in Russia. But otherwise, it's a much quieter place in that respect. So that's a big difference in Russia. And I'll just introduce myself quickly, because I'm going to give you a little bit of biographical information, which actually fits in the story that I want to tell here, which is I'm Nigel Rabb. I'm a professor of Russian history at Loyola Marymount University, right here. When I started and was an undergraduate, all you heard about was the walls coming down in Berlin, Romania, they've gotten rid of the communist dictatorship, and finally the Soviet Union has collapsed. And then I graduated and went into Russian history. So my entire academic career started with this hope of free speech in Russia, this hope of a democratic tradition in Russia. And with every year, you watch this unfold and you were always hopeful. And I, until 3 weeks ago, kept that hope that I had from 30 years ago. But I've been watching these phases, and there are different phases. And I just want to give minor historical background. So in the 1990s, Russia is very democratic, but completely chaotic. And so if in terms of an era of free speech, the 1990s would be the high point in Russia. Putin comes in the year 2000, he replaces Boris Yeltsin, and Boris Yeltsin at that point was considered to be a bit of a clown. Now, if you listen to critiques coming out of the Kremlin, they basically say Yeltsin sold out the country. They're not positive about him. And then in comes Putin. One of the things that Putin did was clamp down and the war in Chechnya. Anna Politkovskaya was a journalist for Novaya Gazeta in Moscow, who about 15 years ago was murdered in her elevator. So there you see an instance of free speech being clamped down on a reporter. In 2015, I think it was, Boris Nemtsov, he's walking behind a water truck in Moscow, right outside the right outside the Kremlin, really right outside the walls. And there are flowers there now on the bridge commemorating this, and they're continually refresh the flowers. But he was also murdered, and he was a protester against the Kremlin. And so what you see, a trend which has accelerated with the war in Ukraine. About a year ago, it might even have been 6 months ago, the Russian court, urged on by the Kremlin, declared Memorial unconstitutional and shut it down. Memorial was the organization that since around 1989 was responsible for revealing all the crimes committed in the Soviet Gulag system. And they developed an archive, a hugely important archive of Soviet citizens who were repressed. The Soviet state, the Russian Federation took over that archive and said, we're taking control of this and we're shutting down Memorial. So if you look at some of the changes that have come in over the last 3 weeks to free speech in Russia, they have precedents. They have precedents, but slow precedents. And so now, though, with the war in Ukraine, there are even more pressures on journalists. There's even more pressure on free speech in the country. And I think Yulia, I think you mentioned that, is just the use of the word war. You're not allowed to use the use of the word war. If you use the word war, you can have up to a 15-year prison sentence. And so an outcome of that one is it's not just using the word, it's speaking badly about the army. And this is a form of censorship where it's got a vagueness to it that the journalists really don't know what they're allowed to publish, and they don't want to risk. They don't want to risk imprisonment for 15 years, not knowing why they were actually imprisoned. And so as a result of that, if you think what I said about Memorial, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, Dozhd, which is the TV station, Rain, which was a liberal TV station in Russia. And when you speak about liberal in Russia, this isn't the same thing as liberal in the United States. Liberal in Russia means much more pro-democracy, pro-constitution, pro-free speech. It has those values. Rather like, whereas in the US, liberal is, I don't know if you want to call it like a left-leaning California thing or something like that, but it's not the same thing. It's a much more broader democratic ideal. So Dozhd closed their offices, and they closed their offices because they don't want to put their own journalists at risk. Echo Moskvy, which is the radio station, which has been broadcasting since 1990, something like that. They were in a similar position, and they've also faced restrictions over the last year, but they shut down their offices because they didn't want to put their journalists at risk as well. Novaya Gazeta is another newspaper in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and it is an oppositional newspaper to the Putin regime. It is still publishing today as we speak. When you look at the websites in Russia now, more frequently, I get sort of, there's some, I don't know what, some sign saying you can't reach this site, or it loads slowly. There's something going on behind the scenes. I don't know what it is, but something's happening. But Novaya Gazeta said, we are going to continue publishing and we're going to continue to report. But they had to make compromises. So what they did is they basically removed all war reporting from their website, and they cleansed the website so that they would not have their reporters arrested. What's interesting in Novaya Gazeta is that when they're not allowed to use the word war. So if somebody said something like, there's a bad war going on in Ukraine, they will quote it as, there's a bad, open square brackets, the word we're not allowed to use, close square brackets, going on in Ukraine. So it's very clear. Or they'll have 3 dots. They'll find their way around the censorship, but it's a very, very difficult situation for them as they do this, because they don't know what is going to happen, because there've already been individuals arrested under the law that who don't know what's going to happen to them because the law is a little bit obscure. So there's that going on. I think everybody knows the incident. Everybody knows the incident on the TV channel, Первый канал in Moscow. It was 2 days ago, which is a really important incident where the former, certainly now, employee of the radio station goes behind the newsroom and has the big banner which says, "No war, don't believe the propaganda, stop it now." Novaya Gazeta published a screenshot of her showing up in the newsroom. But when they published the screenshot, what was on the placard is just blank white. It's just blank white. They didn't have anything on it because they were not sure what words are we allowed to put on the placard and what are we allowed to republish. So they didn't do that. The other part of that story about storming the newsroom with the no war sign, and they quickly cut the news channel quickly cut to a hospital scene or something like that, was that she was immediately arrested. She was taken to the precinct and she was interrogated for 14 hours, but importantly, and then released. So now she's free. But of course, the state is thinking, what are we gonna do? Are we gonna press for 15 years? Are we gonna press for 5 years? So she does not know her future. And we don't know what's gonna happen. Novaya Gazeta, talking about arresting, if you've noticed their protests around Russia, and I think to Kirill's point, that Russians support Putin and he doesn't like the idea just that, we separate the two because they vote him in and they do actually vote. If you look at the protests in Russia, you'll see like 5,000 in Moscow. And Moscow is a city or 5,000 arrests in Moscow. Moscow is a city of 12 million. 4,000 in St. Petersburg, something like this. 3 in Yakutsk, 100 in Novosibirsk, 52 in Kazan. The protests are concentrated in the big cities, in the big capitals, not in the rest of the country. So the rest of the country is a little bit quiescent in this. Novaya Gazeta has got tapes of women who were arrested on a square in Moscow or maybe St. Petersburg and brought into a precinct. And I don't know how they did this, but they got a recording of what happened to them. And you can read the transcript in Novaya Gazeta or you can listen to it. For me, the Russian listening to the transcript is very difficult because it is completely laced with profanity from the Russian policemen who are treating these people. And you see the tactic. They're not sending these women to Siberia. They're not imprisoning them for 15 years. They're roughing them up in the precinct really badly, throwing dirty water on them, calling them bad names, and then they're like, okay, you're free to go. The idea is you do it again, we have a record, it only gets worse. And so there are these intimidation tactics. But it's interesting that Novaya Gazeta could actually publish this. Another thing in terms of the media landscape is something like Izvestia. One of the big ironies listening to Yulia talk is you talked about Prava.ua, the Ukrainian yeah, the Ukrainian Pravda, and keep in mind, Pravda is the former communist newspaper. And Yulia goes to the Ukrainian Pravda for the right news on what's going on
I don't.
in
My
Ukraine.
friend from Kiev pointed that out to me, and that was the source of information.
And it is a good source of information. Go to the Russian Pravda, pravda.ru. It's complete propaganda. And so there's like the same newspaper from the former Soviet times. One becomes an actual legitimate source of information. The Russian one today is propaganda. But you can go to Izvestia. Izvestia is also former communist newspaper, propaganda. What's happening in Mariupol? The Russian soldiers are evacuating 40,000 citizens to safety. The Russian soldiers are providing food to all the people in Mariupol so they don't starve. That's what you get in Izvestia. They interview an elderly Ukrainian woman, an elderly Russian woman, or Ukrainian citizen, Russian speaker, and she's like, "Oh, the Ukrainians are horrible." And so that's what Izvestia is doing. But on the other hand, when you look at Izvestia, they are fully aware that there are sanctions going on. They're reporting the sanctions. They're reporting the inflation. They're basically getting the Russian population to brace themselves for a bad economic times. So they're not lying about the sanctions. They're not reporting on the sanctions. They're blaming the West for the sanctions for sure, but they are getting the population ready for that. Okay, I think I got about a minute and a half. And so the last thing I want to talk about is I think it was today, because Putin gave a speech in Luzhniki Stadium, which was 100,000 people, reported as 150,000, in which, and what's very interesting, this is the soccer stadium where the World Cup final was held in 2018. I can't remember who's in that final. And now he's standing and talking to all these Russians with Russian flags, cheering them on. And basically behind him is a banner which says, "To a world without Nazism." Today is the day when they annexed the Crimean Peninsula. What is it? 8 years ago. And so it's done in commemoration with that. And he's basically saying, we got the Crimean Peninsula back. We have to keep fighting, and we have to protect the rights of Russians. And the crowd cheers. So thank you very much. And I think we can move to questions. Yeah, thank you.
So I think for questions, we're just going to have people raise their hands and speak loudly.
Yeah, so I've heard Putin refer to the whole event as a surgical special operation. How would you distinguish that from a traditional war? If you could please elaborate on that.
So the question was about that Putin refers it to as a surgical strategic operation, and how would one differentiate that between just a traditional war? The Russians, the word special operation is what you have to use. That's mandated by the state. You're not allowed to use the word war. So that's part of their propaganda campaign, by basically just saying it's a special operation. And if you look, for example, Shoigu, who's the defense minister, the top guy in the military, it's always a special operation. Although they do, like in Russian wars, vaina, but they do refer to like vaisk, which is soldier, so like the phonetically, they're very, very close usages there, but you're not allowed to use the word war. That's just forbidden. And that's why the newspaper gets in trouble. Yes.
I just kind of have a question about the potential different usages of the word Nazi or Nazism. Is there anything that we should see in the difference between how Putin and Russia use the word Nazi and Nazism versus us regarding kind of the Second World War and the outcomes? Do they see Nazi as meaning specifically anti-Russian or anti-Soviet in a way that is much distinct from the way that we generally assume it meaning anti-Semitic or just kind of in a more general sense against the rest of the world?
Sorry, does the microphone pick up your question?
You can repeat it. I don't know exactly.
Would you like to answer that?
I cannot answer the question about the meaning of Nazis for the Russians because I haven't been looking at the Russian newspapers or having any contact with my Russian family in Siberia. My aunt died a week ago, and I cannot even send money for the funeral because my relatives would not respond. And my fears are from working with a human rights organization from Russia in the early 2000s for multiple years until the organizations were totally shut down. And fortunately, people I worked with were not in prison, they were just shut down. Perhaps communication is, is watched, and they do not want to get in trouble from getting money from a foreign agent who might be a spy, turned the spy. So, but ways in which the word Nazis is used in the Ukrainian reporting of the war is very interesting because the Russian forces are called fascistic. And it has, to me, ways in which I interpret it. I grew up during the Soviet time. It has direct relationship to invading Ukraine in 22 июля, ровно 4 утра, Киев бомбили, нам объявили, что началась война. This is a Russian song. And about bombing of Kiev, it's a So it has direct, to me, ways in which I'm reading this report, it has direct relationship to that event. And this is the kind of a meaning that, current reporting puts on it's the people who invade, who destroy, who kill, and who are turned into an enemy. This is another very, to me, it's a little bit disturbing because I'm watching the war from afar. I understand the frustration. I try to understand the pain. I try to understand the anger and hatred, which is very natural emotions that people experience. But it's difficult for me to see how not the Russian nations, but people who, well, the soldiers, they are people as well. And I'm absolutely convinced that these people are scared, that these people are confused. People are dying, people are, I don't know how they're treated by the Ukrainian military forces, they're killed, they are turned into non-humans. Very similarly as the Ukrainians are turned into non-humans within the Russian, because this is how wars are waged. It's a manufactured conflict and you have to keep people going. You have to continue this mass murder, which is incredibly disturbing. And I feel that this rhetoric helps to support that.
Yes.
I'm going to stand and project just so that the audiences maybe virtually can hear me.
Yes.
I'm a political science and journalism minor, right? So in our critical issues class, we kind of talked about dog whistles and the usage of vocabulary, specifically in propaganda towards your audience, right? So would you say that the usage of the word Nazi, Nazification, Nazism, right, kind of serves as an emotional dog whistle for post-Soviet societies, right? And especially kind of helps to rally the flag a little bit, especially if you're trying to garner someone towards your cause, right? Whether it's defending the homeland or defending the homeland by invading another country, right?
Oh, for sure, because the denazification claim is just nuts for any number of reasons. And I think the ambassador mentioned that earlier. President Zelensky is Jewish, his prime minister is Jewish. It's very difficult to understand. But in the Russian mind, if you talk about denazification, there is an image of, put aside the horrors of the Nazis, of just major battle against evil opponent. And that does come in, and that's one way to basically get them ready for just a major conflict. The other one, which is true, is that, and there, every propaganda has the tiniest bit of truth. It's like when the Nazis invaded Ukraine, there were a lot of Ukrainians who said, welcome. But why did they say welcome? It's like, we've been living under Stalin, who's basically put us through a horrible famine and put us on collective farms. Anything's better than Stalin. So in the beginning of the war in 1941, many Ukrainians were like, yeah, this is better than Stalin. But, and this is so it's like, it's almost like the Kremlin is focused on this very narrow band, tiny bit of history. But after that, the Ukrainians turned against the Nazis. And yeah, and not only did the Ukrainians turn against the Nazis, but many Ukrainians fought with the Soviet army and repulsed the Nazis. And that part of the story just gets wiped away by the Kremlin. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Gossart. When we talked to Ambassador Pfeiffer, he talked about how he expected the Ukrainians to step up and fight against the Russians, even though many Russians didn't expect that. So I was curious about your perspective as someone who has a lot of connections in Ukraine. Did you expect this response from Ukraine?
To be honest with you, until the very last moment, until my son, who's here, student at Philadelphia, texted me that night on Wednesday, and he said it started and they bombed Odessa, we could not believe it could happen. To me, it was unbelievable. It was the same to my friends. Nobody could believe. Actually, a friend of mine interviewed a lot of students from the Catastrophic University. We have these little experts and the first response during the first week of war. The first response was that we cannot believe it. At the beginning of the 20th century, we are experiencing this. So my feel is that it was unexpected, even though the whole preparation for this to happen started back in 2013. Started with the Maidan. I'm not a historian. I cannot really give you a historical perspective on this war and the factors that shaped it. I have a little bit understanding of what had happened in Crimea with the removal of Tatars, in part because it's a part of what I do, and I have a colleague from Crimea who enlightened about imprisonment of Tatars population and turning Crimea since 2013 into just a military base. So preparations were taking place, but when it happened, it was incredibly unexpected, at least to the civilian population and to me as well. And yeah.
How much do we have time for more questions? We have 3 more questions out there. How much time do you have?
Yeah, at least 5 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Yeah.
That's loud. Yeah.
Very loud. I'll repeat it.
What?
You can come up here if you
Oh
want.
yeah, that's a good idea. So with all the sanctions that the West is putting onto Russia, how much do you think how much more sanctions do you think the West can afford to put on, and how bad do you see this economic squeeze getting for Russia, and where do you think for the Russian population the breaking point is?
So the question is about the impact of the sanctions on Russia. I think in terms of how far can we go, I think the ambassador answered that question, like we're 8.5 out of 10, but the impact on Russia. And so this is, you can, again, even Izvestia will tell you this, but Novaya Gazeta will tell you this. So they've started to have sugar shortages, and they're starting to get the first inkling that there are shortages on a number of different goods. And so that's already kicked in. The other thing that's kicked in is the prices. The ambassador talked about this, but the prices on certain things have just doubled. And because it's not even the value of the ruble internationally, it's what you take home in your Russian job and what you pay for. So those sanctions have a major impact. And I do want to bring up the McDonald's issue, because we talk about, McDonald's, it's like it's not gourmet dining, but McDonald's in Russia is historically significant. So that one is not, it's not that you can't get a hamburger in Moscow anymore, but McDonald's was a symbol of relations between the United States and Russia, warming up, friendliness. And you see, I think it was 1990, the first one opened, crowds in Moscow, crowds lining up for an American burger. So that when McDonald's closes, and they closed 850 restaurants, that's hugely significant. And that's a sanction which is not just economic, it's not just about food, it sends a real strong cultural message. And so it's a matter of how the Russians react to that. And yeah, in terms of will there be mass uprisings? Difficult to tell. Yes.
I'll come up here as well. You just mentioned that, it would be hard to know if there's going to be mass uprisings or any sort of pushback against the Putin regime. So I'll kind of word this a little bit differently. I mean, how do you think the cutoff of the media that we see happening, that clampdown on free speech, is there never going to be that breakthrough moment for the Russian people where those protests really hit home? Or do you think as this war drags out, as more conscripts get sent to the front in Ukraine, eventually it's going to start hitting those places where we don't see the pushback already?
Yes, so the question was whether there's pushback in Moscow today, not mass pushback, whether there's ever reaching a point where the pushback will spread to the rest of Russia. Yulia or Kirill, would you like to answer that question in terms of your sense coming from Siberia?
I have a very pessimistic perspective, primarily because I've lost friends who I worked with to be imprisoned, and these were human rights activists who could not speak outside of Russia. I was approached by the Russian government myself at some point in New York City, asking me, I do indigenous rights, so it's not as scary as doing anything else because the indigenous communities do not possess weapons, and the ways in which indigenous movement and indigenous rights have been squished, pushed, and absolutely destroyed from what had happened in 1990s, and it was a time of a lot of achievement in 1990s. My answer is that I don't expect people protesting. I expect people hiding from not being imprisoned. And it's quite a pessimistic way of looking at things. And this is from just my own communication with people who I know and who I cannot communicate at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I guess recently, Zelensky has sort of said that Western nations and NATO allies share some sort of responsibility for Ukrainian casualties, being that they're not supporting military movement. Is that, I guess, a two-part question. One, is that sort of the belief of Ukrainians generally that the West and NATO has sort of left them behind? And then is there any sort of clear line that's been drawn in the sand, or that you could see being drawn in the sand, where if Russia's to impede on certain territory, where Western nations will have to get involved militarily?
Okay, I'll just repeat the question and then maybe Kirill or Yulia can answer. But do Ukrainians feel that the West and or NATO have just left them behind? And is there a red line which the Russians could cross, which would force the West to actually take more drastic steps?
I can just share a perspective of a military officer I interviewed a few weeks ago. And this person is part of the Mariupol forces. And it was a wonderful conversation, quite enlightening to me, from which I realized that, number one, that the president is not alone of making this statement, and he's a part of a larger group, and military has a lot to say what the president is saying and what we hear from the president. Second thing that I learned from that conversation is that people do feel that the West betrayed Ukraine primarily in relationship to the memorandum when Ukraine abandoned the nuclear weapons. And that was a mistake, something that, as if I were to quote that person, was something that now tells Ukraine that it's all alone facing the threat. Did I answer that? But this is just the two responses that
Yes, yeah.
in my head from what I have learned from this high military official speaking with him about.
I think that's all the time we have. Is that right, Jean? So I think that's all the time we have for questions, and that will end our panel. And I think thank you so much for everyone for sharing, I suppose, this moment with us.